Did ancient scribes add material to the Old Testament? In this lesson, we'll see that not only were there additions to the Hebrew Bible, but they were made even to the Torah itself, the five books of Moses. In the last lesson, we looked at scribal additions to the New Testament, for which our surviving manuscripts go back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. On the other hand, documentation for the Hebrew Bible in its original Hebrew and Aramaic has historically been much later. The oldest manuscripts still in existence were as late as the 10th and 11th centuries AD, about a millennium and a half after the last books were supposed to have been written. This textual tradition is called the Masoretic text and is the basis for most modern Bibles. But then in the mid-20th century, our textual evidence would get moved back more than a millennium when the so-called Dead Sea Scrolls in the desert near Qumran were discovered in caves. Documents which were written between the 3rd century BC up until the Roman destruction of the community around 68 AD. Many believing scholars were elated to discover that among the scrolls, the textual tradition of the Masoretic text found ancient support. However, scholars were also surprised to find other textual traditions which could be quite different in places. By the count of some scholars, the manuscripts of the Torah that parallel the Masoretic tradition only accounted for about 48% of the scrolls. For the other biblical books outside of the Torah, it was only 44%. What was maybe even more surprising was the realization that we actually already had evidence of some of these variant traditions. And it's to be noted that these were not the sort of minor differences you find in wording between various translations of modern Bibles. These differences were much more substantial. Many of the variant traditions found at Qumran were actually already known in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that began to be made around the 3rd century BC, probably with the five books of the Torah. The translation of most of the other books was probably completed by the next century. Our oldest manuscripts of the Septuagint are nearly as old as the Septuagint itself. Until the Qumran discovery, scholars had simply assumed that the Septuagint translators had been quite maverick with the way that they handled the Hebrew text. Although we certainly have ample evidence that the Septuagint translators could be very free with their translation, that did not in fact explain all of the differences between the Septuagint and the much later Masoretic text. One of the clues scholars should have paid attention to before the discovery of older alternative Hebrew manuscripts at Qumran was that the Septuagint version was often shorter, sometimes much shorter than the Masoretic text. Recall that one of the tendencies of spurious variants is that they are almost always additions, not subtractions. Many textual errors are clearly visible in the Masoretic text. A few of the books, such as Samuel, are badly damaged and have many doubtful passages. Modern textual critics and translators will often use ancient versions, such as the Septuagint and the Targums, which are Aramaic translations, to try to fill in the gaps of the Masoretic text. When they do so, typically there will be a marginal note explaining the variant. However, the tendency in scholarship has been to assume the correctness of the Masoretic text and only look to the other sources when a variant in the Masoretic text appears wrong. But many scholars are beginning to rethink this approach since the widespread availability and thorough study of the Qumran documents in only the past few decades. As we'll see, sometimes such textual witnesses, like the Septuagint, can be more informative than we previously thought, and the Masoretic text sometimes less accurate. Let's consider a few examples of damage to the Masoretic text. Several glaring spurious variants never got fixed at all, even the most blatantly obvious ones. You can find some of these even in the highest quality modern translations. In the New Testament, we saw a few examples of alterations that have been left in, even in the most modern translations, but there are many more in the Hebrew Bible. One of the most striking ones that probably gets missed in most Sunday schools is when 2 Samuel 21:19 says that Elhanan killed Goliath, despite the earlier account that David did it. The parallel passage in 1 Chronicles 20 verse 5 seems to be an undamaged text, which says plainly that Elhanan killed the brother of Goliath. Because the histories often parallel each other, we can find similar examples of what appears to be scribal slips, such as 1 Kings 4:6 saying that Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses, but 2 Chronicles 9:25 puts the count at 4,000, a difference of only a single character in Hebrew. and 4,000 seems more likely based on the context that he had 12,000 horsemen. But many variants were intentional and significant alterations to the text. Some of these may have originally been a marginal note, which with enough time was incorporated into the actual text. Other additions were entire chapters, many examples of which are cited throughout my book. We'll look at a few of these in a moment. Some scribal insertions have a rather obvious motivation. For example, 1 Kings 15:5 was originally simply a praise of David, but it seemed to be at odds with 2 Samuel 11, an account of David committing crimes punishable only by death according to the law. So a scribe added, quote, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite, end quote, to the Masoretic text of 1 Kings. As I mentioned before, there were only a few passages of any significant length in the New Testament that appear to be added by scribes. Since our sources for the Hebrew Bible were far later until the discovery at Qumran only a few decades ago, one would expect at least the possibility that the Hebrew Bible had far more opportunity for variants to occur. Believing writers on biblical origins will often highlight the careful copyist practices of the Masoretes, but they lived from 500 to 1000 AD. How careful they were is not relevant if what they copied was not well preserved for multiple centuries before they got it. What is often glossed over in biblical origin books is that we know virtually nothing about early copyist practices for the first few hundred years after the earliest Bible books were written. There are a few places in the Bible where there are mentions of scribes preserving the book or the scroll of God, but no significant details regarding how careful they were or even what book was being referenced. One would expect that they would be careful, but at times they obviously weren't. Otherwise, we would not find variant textual traditions as far back as we have evidence for. Even the Bible itself testifies that for a time they lost the book of the law. That's not exactly being careful with it. How could variants get stuck into the holy writings of Yahweh? There are several possible explanations. We've already noted the difference in information technology that made it harder for the ancients to compare multiple manuscripts to help eliminate errors. There were also periods in Israel's history when Yahweh's priests were not in power and did not even serve in the temple. And the people predominantly did not follow Yahweh. There's that whole issue of the captivity when they were enslaved and the temple destroyed. Just how many writings were lost then? I can't count the number of times I've heard someone complain that they lost some item during a move from one house to another. Imagine how much more you'd lose if you were forced to move because a foreign army attacked, burned your home, and carried you off naked into slavery. Maybe most appalling for modern believers, it would appear that many alterations to the text were due to a totally different attitude toward it. My book covers myriad differences between more modern concepts of inspiration and ancient ones. Where the medieval Masoretes may have tried to preserve the size of the letters, for example, earlier scribes, who originated those letters of varying size, obviously did not take such pains. Worse, there's a lot more evidence that the ancients were much more liberal in the sense that many of them believed that they were allowed to add to the inspired books. We'll look at several examples of this in this lesson and the next. One of the greatest pieces of evidence we have for a different attitude of the ancients toward holy text comes from Qumran itself. In some cases, differing traditions of the same text were found in the same caves. They knew about the differences, and yet they didn't seem to have a problem with them. There are no marginal notes in the alternative traditions to indicate which they preferred, and there were alternative versions for more than half of the books of the Hebrew Bible. But versions of each book were no doubt holy to many of them. This same attitude is found when the New Testament authors quote the Septuagint, even when it differs from Hebrew texts that were available to them at the time. More on this later. Right, wrong, or indifferent, this is clear evidence that the ancients often had a different attitude toward holy texts, even as they revered them. It was the message that mattered, and so scribes would often add to the text to make the message even quote-unquote better, or more in agreement with other texts, such as the additions to the book of Esther in the Septuagint, and in modern Bibles that contain the Apocrypha. Esther originally probably bothered many Jews, as it had no explicit mention of God in it. Similar additions were made to Daniel in the Septuagint, and other apocryphal books fleshed out stories found in the Hebrew Bible that the authors seemed to feel were missing details. such as the origin and the nature of the Nephilim of Genesis 6. So to say that earlier scribes must have been very careful since they revered the holy writings, just like the Masoretes, flies in the face of a great deal of evidence. Sometimes we see evidence that the ancients did care about differences, though at least later in Israel's history. It wasn't always a total free-for-all to add to the holy books. In the letter of Aristeas, written around the 3rd or 2nd century BC, we see possible testimony that there were bad, flawed copies of the Hebrew text, and that they would have to be careful which ones they chose to produce the Greek translation of the Hebrew books that became the Septuagint. While the document is now taken by modern scholars as a fictionalized account, obviously not historical in many of its details, the detail of damaged Hebrew text not only seems reasonable, but also even runs counter to the idyllic storyline of the narrative, which seems to suggest that everything was in favor of them getting this perfect new Greek translation that was. Note that this love of a correct text is in the Hellenistic period, after the Greeks had brought their culture to the whole world. While we know far less about the views of sacred scripture before this period, we do know that the focus on authorship, canon, and closure of canon did not come along until after the Fertile Crescent had undergone one of the most significant, for us today, transformations the world has ever seen: Hellenization. I give several examples in my book of how it's only after the Greek period that we find Jews like Josephus, Philo, and the Apocrypha itself discussing such things as what books are canon, the closure of the canon, and a focus on authorship. Before this era, we see that there are holy books in the Hebrew Bible that never even have authorial claims, something which boggles the modern mind. It would be helpful to understand the nature and motivation for additions to help us spot them better. Scholars tend to agree that the additions to Esther and Daniel, for example, appear to be just that. In other words, the shorter version is more quote-unquote original. Such additions appear to serve certain functions, some of which we've already noticed. Who could pass up a story of Daniel slaying a dragon without using a sword? Likewise, the Apocrypha's alternative versions of narratives found in the Hebrew Bible add choice, juicy bits. They answer questions that inquiring minds want to know. Maybe I can draw an analogy that won't seem too crass. Such traditions are sort of like the tabloids today, which take actual news events, like the divorce of celebrities, and throw in extra juicy details, such as quotes that they never said, or aliens. And if this seems too ridiculous an analogy, consider that the Apocrypha does indeed embellish our understanding of angels, extraterrestrial beings, where the earlier documents of the Hebrew Bible can be frustratingly laconic and leave out a lot of detail. Inquiring minds want to know indeed, and they got their own books by the latter half of the first millennium BC. Again, after the Greeks came along. The nature of many additions, then, should be kept in mind as we consider some possible additions to the Masoretic text, along with such motives for adding them. Before delving into the topic of what Qumran can show us about textual variants, we should make one more note. We've been speaking of scribal additions as if the documents of the Hebrew Bible were each initially written by a single scribe, but this is not the case. In fact, many of the books of the Hebrew Bible appear to be highly composite works, such as the histories of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, and of course the Psalms. I will leave the evidence for the redaction of the Torah for later. For now, we will only focus on the scribal alterations to what appears to be a finished work, regardless of whether it was composite before the alteration. So when we speak of a quote-unquote original rendering, I simply mean an earlier one. To try to reach back further than our most ancient extant documents would require redactional criticism, a topic that is fascinating and sometimes useful, but can often be highly speculative and is mostly beyond our scope here. So what can we learn from the alternative families of texts at Qumran? Many of the variant readings were actually already found in the Septuagint. The translators did not make them up, but got them from these alternative Hebrew texts, which we now have copies of. We cannot always state with 100% certainty which variant is the oldest, but we should often lean towards the shorter variant, as intentional removal of material is extremely rare. We will look at two significant examples. Internal evidence can also help us distinguish various variants. One of the best examples of later additions to the Hebrew Bible are found in the book of Jeremiah. It is approximately 1/6 shorter in the Septuagint. Although a few manuscripts of Jeremiah found at Qumran parallel the longer version of Jeremiah found in the Masoretic text, two of them support the Septuagint's shorter version. In other words, the Greek translators didn't always create variants, but actually often had older Hebrew manuscripts which already contained them. What is the internal evidence regarding which version of Jeremiah is more quote unquote original? Some of the extra material in the Masoretic text is found in 33:14 to 26 and 51:44b to 49a, which are clear interruptions of the narrative. These are totally missing from the Septuagint. Besides missing material, there are many other differences as well, such as a different ordering of the material. One such passage is the Oracles Against the Nations, chapters 46 to 51, which are found after 25:14 in the Septuagint and the alternative Hebrew manuscripts of Qumran. Some scholars argue that the reason that the Masoretic text would change the order seems obvious. The role of Baruch, chapters 36 to 45, would otherwise be the last word, since chapter 52 is an obvious addition on the end of the scroll, a copy of 2 Kings 25, and the end of Jeremiah chapter 51 is a perfectly sensible conclusion. We'll save for later more explanation of the scribal practice of tacking on extra material to the end of scrolls, which is another indicator of the anxious attitude toward biblical documents. I have seen at least one fundamentalist explain the two differences of Jeremiah by simply assuming that Jeremiah wrote two versions. So there you go. But in his defense, Jeremiah itself actually says that Jeremiah wrote different versions, with the second containing extra material. However, in that account, the first one was burned up. Let's now turn to Samuel. And by the way, I'll be speaking of it as a single book, even though it is split into two books in modern Bibles. It is in fact a single narrative, probably originally split in two because it was too long to fit on some scrolls. Similar to Jeremiah, there's a fair amount of material found in the Masoretic tradition of Samuel that is not found in the Septuagint. Recall that Samuel is one of the most damaged books among the Masoretic texts. Among the fragments of Samuel found at Qumran, none reflect the Septuagint's omissions, unlike the book of Jeremiah. However, several Qumran documents at least contain variants only found in the Septuagint and not the Masoretic text. So it's quite possible that if we had the complete undamaged documents of Qumran, they would in fact support the shorter version of Samuel. Now that we've seen with Jeremiah that the Septuagint translators were often using actual shorter Hebrew texts that do not align with the Masoretic text, we can now perhaps take the alternative shorter Septuagint version of Samuel seriously and consider whether the Masoretic text contains additions. Some of the material that the Septuagint omits is found in the David and Goliath story in 1 Samuel 16:18, which is only 49 verses long in the Greek, but 88 in the Hebrew. In other words, it's almost half as long. The extra content in the Masoretic text actually contains contradictions that I've seen Christians puzzle over, such as Saul meeting David for the first time twice, in 16:17 to 23, which is found in both versions of the story, and in 17:55 to 58, which is only found in the Hebrew. Saul's extra attempt to kill David, 18:10 to 11, is only found in the Masoretic text, and appears to be a repeat of Saul's desire to kill David found in chapter 19. Which is found in both the Greek and the Hebrew. The love between Jonathan and David in 18:1 to 4 is also not found in the Greek. Recall that some additions are embellishments designed to appeal to the emotions of the listener or fill in details which were omitted in the earlier version. In the case of Jonathan's love, we have both, as it touches the heart as well as explains why Jonathan later helps David in the story. To put in perspective how much material appears to be added to the Hebrew version of 1 Samuel, there are even more parts that are totally missing from the Greek version. The account of David delivering food to his brothers, his first hearing of Goliath's challenge, and his analysis of risk versus reward in 17:12 to 31, Jonathan and David's covenant, 18:1 to 5, and the story of Saul's evil spirit, 18:10 to 11. And 2 Samuel contains even more. There's one instance for which we have evidence of a rare removal of text. In 2 Samuel 15:8, the Greek text has Absalom say that if God brings him back to Jerusalem, then he will worship Yahweh in Hebron. The Hebrew text omits Hebron.
The internal evidence suggests that Hebron is the original text, since in the preceding verse he said that he had made the vow in Hebron. And it's obvious why it would be omitted, since the Deuteronomistic historian spends so much time saying that there is only one legitimate place of worship. More on that later. I find it ironic that many Protestants reject the Apocrypha, yet have books in their own Bible that contain so many obvious additions that serve some of the functions that the apocryphal works serve. When the Dead Sea Scrolls became widely available in the last 3 decades, we saw no movement to take significant sections out of the book of Samuel. And I don't believe that is because the textual evidence is weak, but because tradition is strong. Publishers publish what people want to buy. And these textual additions are only the tip of the iceberg. In following lessons, we'll even consider substantial evidence for the composite nature of many books of the Bible traditionally thought to be written by one author. But for now, let's consider whether there is simple evidence for textual variants that have even been left, even in modern translations, in the Torah itself, the heart of the Bible. What may concern the modern fundamentalists more than spurious textual variants in books like Jeremiah and Samuel are the ones found in the Torah itself. For instance, there are 2 tabernacle accounts in Exodus. The first is chapters 25 to 31, the second 35 to 40. The first gives an incredible amount of detail regarding how they are to build the tabernacle. The second appears to repeat much of those details as they build it. I have even heard Christians ask in Bible class why there seems to be a duplication of the givings of the extensive design of the tabernacle. These 2 sections are separated by the narrative of the golden calf incident and the breaking and replacement of the tablets. It has been observed that these 2 tabernacle accounts in the Septuagint appear to be translated from an alternative Hebrew version with variants from the Masoretic text. Significant differences particularly appear in the second account, which is shorter in the Greek and often has a different ordering of the laws. This Greek version also has similarities to Hebrew manuscripts from Qumran. At least from a modern perspective, it would be hard to see how these differences are not significant, since these are supposed to be precise laws given by Yahweh. The Septuagint's version of Numbers also has a more sensible ordering of chapters 33 to 36. In another series, we'll cover much more extensive evidence for the composite nature of the Torah, but for now, let's consider how the evidence for ancient attitudes towards sacred texts and examples of how common it was for people to think that they could add to those texts in the next lesson.